Welcome, everyone, to the very first episode of Fortaleza. Today, I'm diving into a topic that has become extremely common in our community. It's a narrative that's repeated in academia, in certain circles, and especially all over social media. Just type Taíno on TikTok and you'll see exactly what I mean. Here's the problem. Many of the claims surrounding the modern Taíno identity don't fully align with historical reality. But this is a conversation we need to have with clarity and truth. Because, and this is just my opinion, you cannot build a full identity on narratives that are made up. So today, I'm bringing someone who can really help us separate the fact from fiction, not ideology, but the research and lived experience. Our guest today is Tanya, an independent researcher who has lived inside the Taino identifying community herself, making her an expert on Tainoism. Now, I discovered her work on academia.com. I read her first paper and I immediately realized she offers a perspective that's missing from the public conversation. So, Tanya, thank you for joining me. For those who don't know you, could you start by telling us a little bit about you and what motivated you to start looking into the identity of Taino?
Oh, thank you for having me today. Wow, this is such a big topic. And I wish I was not an expert on this and still like floating in the dreamland of Tainolandia, but when the truth shall set you free,
Man,
and I was set free, through a series of red flags that became too, I guess, red to not deny. And so I became Taino, and then I found out that I could be Taino one day and not be Taino the next week. And it set me on a journey to figure out where the word Taino came from, what island was Tainolandia, what tribe, where did it come from? I wanted to seek out any documentation from the early Spanish colonial first contact that said Taino. And when I did the work and I did the research and I, went to archives and I did my family tree and I learned that there was not one Taino, at least not until the 1960s, where Taino um, became an indigenous identity in Puerto Rico, thanks to DeVetco.
okay. What is the VECO?
DeVetco is a government program that was implemented in the island by Luis Munoz Marin. It was I think May 14th, 1949. And the Division de la Educación de la Comunidad is a community development program that was under the guise of building libraries and arts and culture in the
Right.
island, but it was really a government program meant to pacify Jibaros and erase culturally what was left of the Spanish
Okay.
influence in the island. And so the targeted population was Jibaro. And the intent was to shame Jibaros, to make Jibaro
Wow.
into a bad thing, to release their feeling of being proud of their Spanish heritage, a feeling of being proud of their indigenous heritage, the Indio Boricua, the original people of the island. The
Okay.
Jibaros were the ones that carried those traditions in. And so Duvedco came in and started to hire people in the island, and made movies to begin to change the culture and create new narratives um, in the island in the 1950s and the 1960s. In 1967, with the movie La Buena Herencia, is where the Taino identity dropped for the first time.
Oh, okay. So it's something that was imported rather than something that was originally and authentically created by us Puerto Ricans. Is that correct?
Absolutely. The
Okay.
Taíno identity is not traditional or authentic to the island of Puerto Rico. It was
Mm,
imposed onto the people of Puerto Rico.
right. And you mentioned the Jibaro, right? Being proud of his roots. I grew up in the mountains, right? I was born in Alto Rey, but I grew up in Sidra. So I grew up that way. And when I went to school, yeah, being called Jibaro was seen as something less than, right? And I'm sure we'll
Mhm.
get into more identity talking points. But yeah, it's in summary, if you become American, you're worth more. But if you're Jibaro, you're less than is something to leave behind. So I certainly understand, but I guess by the time I was born, it was already implemented. So I never truly questioned it. So you mentioned Rafiesk, right? Was he the one that created this? The word Taínos has to be in a document. So how did it all work out into becoming what it is today?
Right. So there has been a few different phases of the word Taino. First phase in the word Taino was essentially the coining by Constantine Samuel Rafinski Schmaltz. And
Rob,
then after he coined the phrase to classify the Creole language in Haiti in 1836. That
okay.
was the whole thing. It was just he classified the language, and it wasn't until Jesse Walter Fuchs that just said in I think it was 1904, 1907, an meeting at a lecture in the Smithsonian that Taino was a suitable replacement for the Antillean race. And that
Mm,
was a direct quote. So then Yale jumped in, and that's Irving Ruse and Ricardo Alegria. And then, they kind of pulled it in to create this uh, culture based on their interpretation of artifacts.
you say
And
Ricardo Alegria?
yeah,
So it wasn't
yeah.
just outsiders. There was kind of like help from the inside, so to speak.
Yes, exactly. So, um, Ricardo Alegria, has affiliation with Yale and all of that circle of archaeological community within that time. And so it didn't completely come out of left field. I mean, the
Right.
Smithsonian was leading the charge, essentially. Yale University was leading the charge. And so it was a natural progression to bring it into the island with the community development program. Anytime you see community development, it's bad.
Yeah.
it's it's
Yeah.
bad for the community.
I learned that. Every time I hear something like that, I usually take my time to look into it and see who is behind it, who's pushing it, and then I look into their ideology. So thank you for bringing that up.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And so then after Taino was dropped with La Buena Herencia 1967, which is a movie narrated by Ricardo Alegria.
Mm,
And Um, by that time you have from 1949, with the beginning of Divedco's movie extravaganza, with Decide de las Nubes, right? Which is the first Divedco movie, and it's of a plane that shows the island. And it goes into the different industrializations of the island, and it's the introduction of showing how modernization is above traditional farming practices.
mm.
And
Wow.
so you have from 1949 to 1967 this imposition of Americanization, American industrial thinking into the island. So then by 1967, the to shame the Jibaros was already the foundation was already set. So when Devedko brought in the new identity, the Taíno, the African, the Spanish, instead of just Borinquenses or Puerto Riqueño, there was the three identities that were brought in, Taíno being one of them. The the lean towards moving away from Jibaro and adopting Taíno was not something that was difficult, essentially, because people had already begun to see the change in that cultural awareness and acceptance of Jibaro. By the 1970s, the past tense of Taíno became present tense. And by the 80s, there was a push for Taíno to become present tense and taking it out of past tense, where we find a group of core people who are the creators of Tainoism, essentially creating this indigenous identity, a Native American identity that's based in this romantic idealization of Native Americans and this romanticized version of being a Native American. So this is where we started to experience race shifting of
Okay.
Tainoists moving into Native American spaces. And so then following that in the 90s, that's when Tainos began to get really politically active and do things like set up the foundation to seek out federal recognition or federal
Oh, okay.
acknowledgement using an identity that isn't historically accurate, that was actually imposed in the island, not carried through historically. So that's the timeline essentially.
Okay. So I see how it became what it is today. And the first thing that comes to mind, I mean, I got a lot of questions, but the first one that pops in my head is, did anybody on the island ever offer any pushback to this?
Oh, absolutely. There's a professor, rest in power, Dr. Gabriel Haslett Vieira. He
Okay.
was an ardent pushbacker of Taoism, and also Dr. Randall Sloan. He's in Europe right now. He was in the island and began to push back on the island. He ended up going to Europe because I think just, Tainoists tend to go after anybody that challenges the Taino
Oh, yeah.
identity. And so even Francisco Moscoso in 1995 pushed back against it, believe it or not,
Okay.
which is
Who
very
was it?
interesting.
I don't, it doesn't sound familiar to me. Who was it quickly so that we can,
Yeah, he wrote El Censo del Ando, right? Historiografía y Crítica, and doesn't mention Taíno in 1995. And so, I mean, it's just, it hadn't hit in all directions at that time. It wasn't mainstreamed yet. It was still fringe.
okay, like
And
seeds
so,
just kind of growing?
right, right. It really started to become more mainstream in the aughts.
Okay. In the this, right? And
Mhm.
I kind of want to circle back in that because, like, what was their intention, right? Because, yeah, we have in the 2000 where it became more prominent. I guess it was being pushed more.
Mm,
But from those people who originated this identity as a suitable replacement, and also including Ricardo Alegría in all of this,
mhm.
what was their intentions? Was it malicious? Was it convenience? Like, in your opinion, what was it?
I think it was colonialism. It's assimilation. It's an example of an Americanized colonization. It's American colonization. America goes into a country and strips everything from its past and creates a new one. So the people only depend on the narratives that America gives them. And
Hmm.
so it's essentially a gaslighting of our original heritage.
Yeah, and I remember growing up with this we part of America. Yet, when you look in the insular cases, it specifically says that
Right.
we belong to but not part of. And now when people say people still don't know Puerto Rico is part of America, I usually ask, how many Puerto Ricans came on the Mayflower? We were here long before the Pilgrims. We know our history in that sense, but we don't really click. And it's that assimilation that erases what was to make something new. It's kind of the idea of burn the old to build something new. So I guess these individuals in academia were just part of this colonial environment and it just kind of ran with that. No specific intentions behind it, no specific goals.
Well, I can't speak for somebody's core intent. What I can see through history, though, and put two and two together was a lot of this shifting of culture of demonizing our heritage started after the Spanish American War. And so in 1898, Americans wanted to get everything that they could from Spain and erase it essentially or demonize it so that it would prevent people from Spanish heritage of being proud of their legacy
Mm,
and to present the idea that the Spanish and indigenous relationship was horrible and terrible, and that is
right.
within the realm of La Leyenda Negra, which demonizes the Spanish rather than show things for what they really were.
If you create division between two ancestries, you fracture identity because we come from both. So if you have one demonize the other, then I guess in a way you can kind of hate yourself or destroy yourself, making it easier for a new narrative to replace it because who wants to carry on something that's bad, right?
Exactly. And also, it helps to keep people with Spanish last names in this country marginalized. Because
Yeah,
if people are hating their Spanish heritage, then
yeah.
people can be marginalized in this country because people aren't given the education to realize that it wasn't the Mayflower that came first. It was the Spanish that came first. And, 1513, that was 100 years before any Brit landed, with the intent of settling here. But one of the things that is I really encourage people to challenge is the idea that the Spanish were horrible. Because a lot of the things that I've read contradict the American narrative that the Spanish were horrible. And for an example, in the archive that I curated, I've got a letter to the Queen from Guebana, essentially, in 1511.
Okay.
And it says letter honoring Cacique Guebana and
Huh.
a communication from Guebana. And in that letter, it says that the Spanish are grateful essentially for Guebana's help in a battle that was centered in not allowing the crown to have overreach in the island of Borinquen. And so Cacique Guevana led a charge with a few other caciques and raided a Spanish settlement of a guy that was proposed to be governor as per the crown, rather than having an island elected governor. And so the people who were on the ground at that time said, no, we're not going to do that in Borinquen. We're our own thing. And so that's what it's called. The Taíno Rebellion of 1511 wasn't because the Indians were mad at the Spanish. It was because the Indio Boricua and the Spanish got together and said, hey, we're in charge of our island. There was coexistence there. So within that coexistence, it was to create their own government. Like this is how we do things. But from an Americanized perspective, right? It's and from the Taíno perspective, it's the Spanish were horrible. They killed people. They put babies on rocks and stuff like that. And all of that comes from La Leyenda Negra. But when you read the actual documents, it completely contradicts everything Taínos say, everything Americans say to shame our Spanish heritage and
Yeah.
ancestry.
It's interesting that you say that because when you start looking into history, you start seeing that the Anglo American world was one of replacement, right? Eradication,
Right.
extermination. And you see the Hispanic American story, although it's not always pink story either. It's one of there's mixing, right? There's one of where hey, we both became a new population, a new people.
Mhm.
And I hear you saying that in Puerto Rico, but in Canada at the time, they started creating their own things. And based on what you've seen throughout history, is that something that we share from the very beginning, in your opinion?
Absolutely. I mean, it the island people started to go into the island in 1493. This is something that we know, right?
Okay.
And there was settlements here and there. There was more trade than settlement in the island. And so by 1510, 1511, there were villages, there were places where people coexisted. There were places where people were negotiating lands and farms, and yes, there were
Yeah.
encomienda systems, right? So by 1511, the island was, not necessarily sparsely populated, but it also wasn't not populated either.
Right.
So for the first 20 years, there was growth, population growth in the island. One of the things that's very interesting within the history is that um, the Spanish in Puerto Rico were not there to terrorize people because they didn't want to create that friction. It was to initiate trade because if people were treated bad, they wouldn't get the goods, right?
Yeah.
So there was that part. Of course, in the 1520s, when Queen Isabella and Ferdinand were no longer royals and the next king came in, that's when things started to get funky with religion. Right.
Okay. So let me summarize this a little bit. This Taino identity isn't something that's actually ours. It's something fabricated from academia, colonialism. Now the intentions are irrelevant, right? We don't know them personally. Neither are they here to defend themselves. But nevertheless, it was fabricated for us as a suitable replacement of our authenticity, right?
Mhm.
Now, the goal was to study the language, but then it shifted into from indigenous Boricua to a Taino identity. And then it got reinforced not from people just the outside, but also Ricardo Alegría participated in this. And eventually it got so deep into our community that now it seems something that is a matter of fact.
Right. So let me backtrack just a sec with the Ricardo Alegría, he did a lot of good for the island. He opened up museums, he connected culture, he did a lot of good for the island. And his legacy in the island is deep. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
However, it also he carries that imposition of Taíno into the island as per that government-led program Divedco, which was under Divedco is a division under the government program called Operation Serenidad. And so Operation Serenidad, that's that community development program. I didn't clarify that earlier.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that Taíno with the Smithsonian was used to classify artifacts found in the Antilles. And then when he used race, he basically said Taíno for everyone and all the artifacts.
Oh,
And so if somebody found a semi in Hispaniola in the Dominican Republic, it would be labeled Taíno. If somebody found a semi in Cuba, it'd be labeled Taíno. If somebody found a semi in Borinquen, it'd be labeled Taíno. And so instead of having the classification of a semi being semi, island, Borinquen, indigenous people, Indio Boricua, region, Guamani, 1490, whatever,
right.
1477. It doesn't say that. It just says Puerto Rico, Borinquen, Taíno, Semi.
Okay. So it's a general classification to
A
it.
general classification. And this acts to displace our connection to our ancestral land. So somebody who grew up in where you grew up in the mountains wouldn't know who your cacique is or have that connection to your cacique. All they would know is Taíno. So it severs that connection to the land. It severs that connection to history and heritage and what can I learn about my region instead of I'm Taíno and this is the information that's fed to me and which makes me dependent on Taíno, not allowing me to celebrate my bloodline heritage.
Yeah. Your authentic
Exactly.
ancestry. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, our indigenous ancestors ran by their own caciques. It wasn't there's this national identity. Rather, I am my cacique and our people. And there were
Hmm.
different ones on the island itself.
Absolutely. In the documents that I've read, it's the cacique and his people.
Okay. It specifically says it like that.
It specifically says it like that. Like cacique, name your cacique and his people. Guemana and his people. And so that's how it's determined. In that letter honoring Cacique Guabana, that's how it says. Nobody's gonna mess with Cacique Guabana or his people. He's the top guy on the island. Everybody respect him. Don't bother him.
Okay. Yeah. So
That's what.
can I'm really intrigued about that because the whole Black legend, I think anybody looking into it can at least now agree that a lot of the stuff was exaggerated at least. But you've gone into this much longer than I have. For those people who are listening, what would you say to them as far as our indigenous ancestors in Spanish, so that we can go from understanding this fabricated identity to something that it's authentic.
Right. So, wow, thank you for bringing that in. So, La Leyenda Negra was uh led by the Protestants in the mid 1500s. I mean, it spans. It still
Yeah, oh
happens
boy.
today. And
Yeah.
so when we're looking at how the Spanish are portrayed today, it's through the lens of La Leyenda Negra. And so when we
Yeah.
look at take those pictures, those little black and white sketches of the Spanish burning and, chopping off hands and throwing babies on the rocks. Well, that wasn't actually a Spanish book. It's not from a Spanish book. It's from a German book. And those sketches were made in Amsterdam in around the mid 1500s to demonize the Spanish because, it's not about the money, it's about the money. So, right? Because the Spanish were making so much money that the Protestants got all bent out of shape about it and had to demonize them so that they can get in there and plant their
Yeah,
flag and make their money
right.
off. sugar
tap into
too.
the
And so when we see how the Spanish are portrayed today during those first contact times, it's not actually through the lens of Spanish documentation. It's through the lens of La Leyenda Negra, of books and sketches and things that were written to demonize the Spanish. So looking beyond that into Spanish documentation, and that's where that real truth is. That's where
mm,
that connection is. I think sometimes people maybe want to believe that the Spanish are horrible so that they
yeah,
can claim this, oh, I'm disconnected Indian and look what the Spanish did, and it adds to that Taíno fabricated generational trauma because it would be inconvenient for a Taino to say, well, the Spanish and the Boricua Indians coexisted for hundreds of years.
yeah.
And so when talking about history, it's important to bring in La Leyenda Negra to better understand how these perspectives of Spanish heritage and ancestry were formed.
One common theme that keeps popping up, it's this fabrication of the black legend, because Protestants are still to this day very aggressively anti-Catholic. When you look at when you look at the Spanish heritage, the Spanish are like the most Catholic, right? Like
Right.
they're like the spear of Catholicism,
Yeah.
and then you have this battle, and that battle transfer over to the New World,
Mhm.
and it breaks communities because you take them away from their authentic history.
Absolutely. I mean, and and that's essentially how Tainoism has thrived is within that confusion because
Okay.
they can Tainoists can take history, make it very confusing, convoluted, change, this I even found a book. I found a book where it says ni Taino in it. And if you look at the book, I believe it's one of Peter Martyr's book, De Obra Novo, and in it it says Ni Taino. And when I took the Latin out of the book and translated it, the Latin was incorrect. It was like somebody had went in there and photoshopped Ni Taino on there and then
Mm,
uploaded the book. And also, that book doesn't match any other books. And so there's something going on where Tainoists throw in this confusion so that it keeps people dependent on the narratives and the concepts that are inherent in Tainoism, and that includes confusing history so people don't ever really have access to or learn the truth outside of what Taino dictates as the truth, which coincides with
oh,
La Leyenda Negra, which coincides with the colonization of our heritage by the
yeah.
Americans during Operation Senaridad.
So they sort of use the current colonization, the current power to as support to also add their own and kind of destroy being Puerto Rican really, because can't be Puerto Rican without the Spanish. It's just there's people out there who say I'm proud to be Puerto Rican. I hate the Spanish though. Okay, well that very identity is Spanish. And it's just like Puerto Rico didn't come from our African or indigenous ancestors. You waving an identity that is from Castilla, right? Because the language Castellano, and then the grammar Alejandro de Nebrija was the one who codified it first in Europe. Then other European nations followed, and now we don't even learn about that because first anything that is Spanish we gotta be afraid of or hate.
Mm.
But that's what bothers me because what I'm understanding is that there is a curated list of I don't know books or anything, but there is a codified, approved knowledge base for Taíno. Am I hearing that right?
Yes.
Oh, wow. And what happens
Yes.
when you question, hey, what about this book? Kind of doesn't go with what's curated here, what's going on here.
There's there's a few things that happen, right? There's either um the Tainoists, if I post something that directly contradicts Taino concepts and narratives. Say like I post ordenanzas para tratamiento de los indios, right? Which are
Okay.
the Leyes de Burgos that were written in 1512. And it's a royal provision issuing new ordinances regarding the treatment of the Indians in the island of San Juan de Puerto Rico. There's 35 chapters, and it was written in December 27th, 1512, right? There's no Taino mentioned in the document. So say I post this very real link to our history,
Yeah.
right?
Written by the people who existed at the time and lived it.
Written by the people who were there,
And the
right?
Spanish wrote everything too. They documented a lot. They
Everything.
were, yeah.
Everything, right? There was documentation on the island and there was documentation sent to Spain. So there are two sets of documentation. So no matter what happened in the island where hurricane whatever hit, there was a copy in Spain.
Okay.
And so say I post this thing up, very real part of history, and a few things will happen. Either nobody will comment on it. There'll be like mad angry faces. Or I'll be personally attacked. Like for whatever, like, oh, this is, she's crazy or she's this or don't listen to her.
Really?
This is nonsense. I love the ones that are like for her followers. Don't, listen to her. Don't do anything, don't interact. I mean, I'd be people like, and it's like,
Yeah. I
but
mean, if you're right, if you believe that the knowledge you have, that the sources you've accumulated are what is factual, you shouldn't have any problem with people following anybody. To me, would be, hey, why don't we just all talk about it? Here are all the sources, and just let that be it, right? Let's just have a conversation. I think that when people do that, it's because they know that if people read everything, the narrative will collapse.
absolutely. Collapse is a really good word for it because when people begin to read what actually happened, the Taino narratives, they just absolutely collapse. They'd have nothing to hold on to. So the only way to protect those narratives and those concepts is to attack the person who brings anything that challenges
Right.
those concepts. And so
The reputation.
Tainoists are well versed in character assassination. I've done it when I was a Taino. Tainoists are very well versed in doxing people, um, which is, fortunate for me because, I don't have, this is my job. Like, this is my whole
Yeah.
job, and I'm my own boss. So if somebody wants to complain about me to me, go right ahead. I mean, you're not the first one, but if I were to get a job today, and this is sad to say, the Tainoists would find that job and get me fired.
Yeah, and I think that it's going to work against them because you have to understand that this is documented too,
Mhm.
right? If somebody gets fired from a job, that is documentation. Now, when did it
Mm,
happen? Oh, when I started talking about Taínos, and it's not just about Taínos. This is our heritage. So
mhm,
when you simply start looking into our heritage, there's people that hate that. That
mm,
hate if you hate this, then you hate our people. You hate who we are. You hate
mm.
Puerto Ricans. You hate yourself. You hate Puerto Ricans. If you go after them, get them fired for learning about our true history and heritage. This is
Right.
why I don't believe anymore that we Puerto Ricans are one people. what I've seen from Taínos and other groups have taught me that is not true. Like I don't want to hear we Puerto Ricans, one people, one flag. It's all BS. I've seen
Right.
some of them just like attack people like you wouldn't believe, right? But I'm only seeing this from the outside. Like, really tell us about it so that we can have this contrast so that people can really understand it. But from my perspective, help me understand it. Like it's just hateful people.
Well, I'm gonna push back on that
Yeah.
because I was a Taino for a few years and was inside and helped rewrite the Taino or the people versus Columbus and rethinking Columbus with the Zen Education Project. I've done a lot of different things with as a Taino when I was a Taino. And none of the things that I did, I have in my mind were hateful, right? Well, one of the things that I was expected to do was to protect the group, to protect the Taino name. And so that's when I started to see, or, through my healing from Taino, began to see how Taino is an ism. So Tainoism acts like a high control group. And another word for a high control group is cult. As a high control group with Taino, it has its concepts, its narratives, its doctrines, and people are to stay within those concepts, narratives, and doctrines. There's
Okay.
a way to look, right? So people dress up like they're Tainos, right? So there's an appearance factor there. There's also a stripping away of a person's identity to become Taino, right? So they'll get a Taino name and they'll start to identify as Taino and to be accepted as a Taino within the group. So the essence of when somebody becomes Taino lives squarely or circularly within the realm of belonging.
Okay.
And
That,
and
that's a big word.
that's a big word, right? Because
Yeah.
for people for our greater Antilles diaspora, belonging in this country is, it's a challenge. There's a lot of
Yeah.
identity stories of people who are in the diaspora who maybe not fit into this group or not fit into that group. And then they find Taino, and
Mm,
Taino offers that belonging based on just, hey, I feel Taino in my heart, in my soul, and I want to be Taino. Yeah, go ahead. You can be Taino.
okay.
And so, when bringing in that aspect of it is essentially from the space of belonging. Taino offers a community where people can belong. Now, when in that community is where that other stuff is expected. So when people enact harm onto anybody that challenges Taino, it lives in the realm of acceptance. And so to be accepted as a Taino, to maintain that belonging in the group, enacting harm, which is basically just their childhood trauma on display,
Okay.
is how to keep that connection in not only protecting Tainoism from anybody challenging, but protecting their community from being dismantled with truth. If anybody challenges Taino to the extent where the truth allows Taino to dismantle itself, because it's going to be Tainoism that dismantles itself. Nobody can dismantle Taino from the outside. The truth once people begin I'm seeing it now. People are learning the truth who are actually Taino and going, you know what, man, I don't know about this Taino stuff. I'm Boricua.
Okay.
you know?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
it's happening more and more because people are starting to see the toxicity that accompanies that belonging and acceptance and harm that is inherent in Tainoism.
and
and
in our community
and
as
in
a
a
whole.
community, right? And so instead of moving forward as a population, right, as Puerto Ricanos, as Boricuas, healing our heritage, it's harming to protect a fabricated concept. Mm,
But let me see if I understand this right, because you mentioned that there's a lot of people in the diaspora looking to belong, and that's actually a project I'm looking to build because I've seen a lot of videos on TikTok of
mm,
people talking about how they missed the island, or how the people. One lady said and she came to the States at 9, and she's grateful for her friends here in the United States, but it's not the same, right? It's there's something missing there,
mm.
right? So I get that there is this need to belong to a group because we know, just from knowing our story and our last names, we are part of something very different and very unique. And because we are conscious about that, when we don't have it, it breaks us. So they look for a place to belong, and when they find it in Taíno, they feel, "Now I belong here." And when something or someone comes for the brand, it feels does it feel righteous to defend it, not because of necessarily ideology, but because you feel you're defending the group that you finally belong to?
Of course.
Okay,
Yeah, of
okay,
course. I mean, there is a righteousness definitely involved because it's like this group has given me a sense of who I am, of connection with with what they tell me is authentic.
okay.
But that's key there. What they tell me
Mm,
is authentic, over what's actually authentic, and I think that you really summed up what I call displacement trauma really well with regards to the woman you were talking about in TikTok. That there's something different, right?
yeah.
Like
You're aware of it.
you're aware of it. You don't have to grow up in the island and to know that being Puerto Rican is you just can't race shift completely as a Puerto
Exactly.
Rican. There's always going to be somebody in the room that goes, "You don't belong here,"
Mhm.
and they may not say it, and they may vibe it, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
They may
that's entirely true. Your eyes can be blue and blonde hair and light skin, but your last name is Hernandez Montañez.
Right, and, so as everybody's all like, "Yeah, yeah, yeah," until they hear the last name, and then
Yeah,
somebody's, from across the room giving, that eye that
yeah.
everybody knows,
Oh,
and
it's one of those blondies.
yeah, and then everything there's like a change in the energy, and stuff, and so that I think we all know that and have experienced that as Puerto Ricans and off island,
Mhm.
that displacement trauma. And so seeking out something that can provide us that connection to the island. And for decades, for the past few decades, since the 90s, right? 80s, 90s, all that's been offered is Taino.
Is that the biggest community in the diaspora, the Taíno group? As far as the diaspora, what is the biggest influence?
Well, I think that's one of the reasons why I started to really, put a lot of emphasis on bringing awareness to Taino because I've seen a shift recently go from, Puerto Rican to Taino. And so I'm looking at it like it takes 4 generations to lose a language or a culture. And right now
Right.
we're looking at our 3rd generation and the next generation that comes up, um, our Indio Boricua heritage will be completely erased with Taino. It will be gone and it'll be extinct. It'll be the essence of genocide will have been achieved with Taino replacing our Indio Boricua heritage in the next generation. So that's
And
why I'm
that's
like,
yeah,
you know, putting as much as I can out there
right.
so that I can prevent that from happening. So that displacement, right, offers the opportunity for Taino to come in and be that population, be the go-to, essentially, you know, of people off island. Now, is the population big? Not really. Tainos make up like what, 20,000? So in the
Okay.
grand scheme of things, Taino isn't, a large community. However, their influence
Well, we're loud.
is it's very well cultivated and has established itself in areas that help to maintain and promote the Taino concept so that people just kind of accept it rather than
Okay.
challenge it. Yeah.
Yeah, I saw on TikTok once, I guess, mayor of somewhere in the States, mayor of a city, where he was reading about Taino. So it's not just groups, but, politics, right? Who knows how big it could get?
Well, that's the recent thing, right? Is to impose Taino into state and municipal governments through proclamations and resolutions, which hold no political weight, right? They're just ceremonial.
Okay.
Like you can put like you can get a proclamation, if you wanted to go to your state and go, hey, I do this for the community, I do that for the community, I want a day in my name. And then you apply for it, and then they go, "Okay, here you go. Here's a day in your name." And they
Mm,
read it, and then that's it, right? There's no law, there's no nothing. And so what
right.
Tainoists are doing today are systematically going to counties, cities, and states and applying, right? Applying for proclamations and resolution or to declare themselves. And this is just such an abuse of our, proclamation and resolution. Declare themselves recognized by that state or by that city
So they use
as an indigenous tribe.
okay. So they use a ceremonial
Mhm.
proclamation, something ceremonial to somehow portray that this is now not law, but recognized at the government level.
Yes.
Okay.
And that is fraud, number 1, right? Out and out fraud because they're manipulating these resolutions and proclamations to determine themselves as recognized by the state or by the county or by the city. And so if you were to ask, oh, well, are you recognized? The Tainoists will say, oh, yeah, we're recognized in this state and we're recognized in that state. When in reality, that's bullshit, you know? They're not recognized. They have
Ah,
they have a ceremonial proclamation that is, essentially, once it leaves the floor of legislature, it holds no weight.
I'm trying to understand the breakdown of the groups themselves because, like I said earlier, there's people looking to belong, but there's got to be other people that already know past the books, right? The made up identities. Somebody's got to know the whole story and continue on the narrative.
Right. So there
Mm,
is a hierarchy,
okay.
um, and there is a cabal. Right? The leadership of Tainoism is so fiercely protected. That's why there hasn't been a new cacique at that upper level since
Okay.
its inception, right? Since the
Yeah.
90s.
Yeah. That's what I'm
So
looking for.
right. So
These hierarchies.
there's a cabal of who I call fobuelas. And those
For
were the
Buelas?
original
Yeah.
the fobuelas. And they're the original uh They're the originals. They've been around since the 70s and the 80s.
Okay.
And then you have um their specifically chosen uh, entitled caciques. So they're the ones that gave these caciques the titles. And so then, you've got about 4 or 5 that are still left, within the realm. And, they're chosen because of their business acumen, they're entrepreneurs, they're charismatic,
Ah,
and the Fobuelas have dirt on them. And so whatever these guys do, they stay within that Fobuela under the Fobuela umbrella, because if they start to go out in different directions, the Fobuelas threaten them, right, with this dirt.
okay.
And so now you've got this second layer, right? So you've got the top of the pyramid, which is the Fobuelas, and then underneath the Fobuelas are the caciques that they run. And so there are a few caciques that, have decided to do their own thing, and they have, had protests against them. I think there was a cacique that took off and then started to do something in Puerto Rico. And then there was like this, petition put out against him, from the Fobuelas. Like, and so, the Fobuelas are essentially the people who create the narratives, who invent the ceremonies. The caciques are the ones who do the gathering of the people, and front themselves as that wise indigenous man,
Yeah.
like the father figure of a
Yeah.
Taíno Indian, like whatever.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
it's
The
just such a
faces
show.
of
It's a dog and pony show, right?
yeah.
And so then underneath those caciques are the next layer of the pyramid, which are the people that are seeking to be caciques, but they'll never be caciques because they don't know how to create these stories,
Okay.
right?
The battle of
Mm,
the words, you know.
Right. They don't know how to create the stories or how to keep that going, right? They don't know how, because they weren't there from the beginning. They don't have that training that the Fobuelas have in order to maintain Tainoism. So, I mean, in essence, after those caciques are, out, the Tainoism collapses on itself, because then it's just, it the there's nobody that's left that was
Continuity.
that can continue it in the way that it was created in the beginning. And so then underneath there, you've got the close followers, and those are the people that you see at the powwows and stuff like that. And then you have the fringe. And those are the ones that are on TikTok and Facebook and posting, and oh, you see a Taino post and they're like, "Oh my gosh, I'm so glad I'm Taino." Those are the at the fringe, and they don't really know what's going on at the top. All they know is that they like the community and they like what it says, and so they're going to vibe on that. And so those are the different layers, and that fits within the realm of Dr. Stephen Hassan's BITE model,
Bite?
BITE, of
Yeah, talk about that.
hierarchy of a high control group, and it fits perfectly within that parameter.
So, what benefit do they get?
Social clout,
Does that
right?
also align with belonging, in your opinion?
Well, I mean, if a
Okay.
person is in an area, say like Phoenix,
Right.
and there's not a huge Puerto Rican community there. There might be some Puerto Ricans there, but there's not like a huge Puerto Rican community like in New York. It helps to alleviate that initial charge of going, "Oh yeah, I'm Puerto Rican." "Oh yeah, you're Puerto Rican? Oh, that's cool." But if somebody goes, "I'm Taino," And then somebody goes, "Well, what does that mean?" They go, "Oh, well, I'm indigenous to the island of Puerto Rico." "Oh, you're indigenous," right? It's the adding that indigenous part, right?
Yeah.
And so now all of a sudden that person is treated differently. They're
Yeah.
treated as an indigenous
Oh.
person and not as a Puerto Rican.
Oh. In what ways do you think it differs from being treated as Puerto Rican and indigenous? Because the truth is also we're not indigenous. We have indigenous ancestry,
Mm.
but that indigenous ancestry, it's ancestrally, genetically, historically, culturally mixed with Africans and Europeans. Those are completely non-indigenous. So what we are now, it's not indigenous. We part indigenous. So I think that's really important because what are you once you're mixed? And you
Mm.
speak like all three of them. Mostly like one of them, right? The Spanish, because it's our largest ancestry. But not just what are you, but who are you? When you realize that regardless of what narrative, you do carry identities and things that are not culturally adopted. They are culturally, historically, ancestrally inherited.
I think you make a really good point though. Hold on. Let me jump in here really quick because you make a really good point with regarding being able to identify your family, right? So
Yeah.
somebody who is indigenous or native, their parents are a part of a tribe. Their grandparents are a part of a tribe. They can go all the way back, as far back as they can, and know that they're a part of that tribe specifically. It says it in documentation. There's no question about it. They grew up
Mm,
in the ceremonies. They grew up singing the songs. They grew up doing all of the things. So when somebody claims to be an indigenous Taíno person who has become Taíno and is in a space where they're learning culture, I challenge people to ask after healing, this is when it became clear for me,
right.
how come I
Process.
believed, right? How come I believed that the things that my family practiced when I was growing up that were called traditional weren't ceremonies? How come I didn't believe that what, my family has traveled through time, right? Not, generations and generations and generations to make up who I am isn't whole, that I would have to go to identify this other thing that I would later find out was completely fabricated in the first place.
Mm,
And so, I want to, bring that in because with people who are legitimately indigenous, there's no question because it's documented for centuries. Their culture, their tribal name, their families, their ceremonies, their everything. Where Taino, everything is invented, it's fabricated in
yeah.
the 21st century. So there's nothing actually authentic or traditional about it. And it and to think, right? To think that actual legitimate indigenous people don't see that, don't recognize that disconnect of authenticity is mind-boggling because when I healed from Tainoism, people tell me now that, they go, I work with a native organization and they tell me oh man, this Taino, they're playing Indian at this powwow and it was so obvious, and I didn't talk to them. I couldn't even look them in the eye because it was just so weird.
Yeah.
Where Tainos sell the idea of an indigenous identity, people who are legitimately indigenous know that that indigenous identity isn't authentic. And I think that's a very important thing because we've got Tainos going out there in powwows in plain style dress, claiming to be an indigenous Taino, where all the indigenous people are like, oh, that's nice, nice, nice. But no.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a what is it that they some people call it LARPing where people dress up and
Yeah,
play and
cultural appropriation, LARPing, cosplay, you know?
yeah, and that's I
Mhm.
mean, in my opinion, it's disrespectful to actual indigenous people because like you mentioned that they can prove, right? They have no confusion.
Mm,
Yet for us, yeah, we definitely have indigenous ancestors. We are part indigenous, but that's only one component. Just I don't know. To me, it's disrespectful to actual indigenous
yeah,
people.
it is, and they know it too, it's not like, legitimate indigenous people don't know that Taínos, they don't they see Taínos as inauthentic. They'll play with them, and they'll say, "Oh, I'll entertain you for a second," but
Yeah,
at
cool
the end of the
feathers.
day, they know.
Yeah,
And, even if they don't wanna admit it at first, the first wind of truth, they go, "Oh, yeah, I knew it."
yeah.
And I
Yeah.
don't mean to speak for indigenous people. I share from
Okay.
my experience in conversations with many different indigenous peoples who come to me and say, "Hey, look, man, this person, are they real? Are they not real? Can you give me some
Like,
insight on this?" And
nah, they're
you
Puerto
know,
Ricans. They're not.
yeah, that's what I
Yeah,
said. Because no, man, they're just Puerto Rican.
yeah. It's like it's kind of sad because
Yeah.
I mean, there's two faults to this. Right, there's we damaging our reputation as a people because you're pretending to be something you're not. But yeah, so yeah, it's kind of hard for me to kind of link them together because when is the point to be empathetic and when is the point to no man, this is disrespectful. You got to stop.
Right. One of the things that I've noticed amongst our people is a, general, speaking in generalization, where it's a gift. I think it's a generational gift and has been weaponized by Tainoists, by Fobuelas and Fosiques, because they're not real caciques, they're Fosiques, right? And
For
so
yes,
Fosiques,
is that
Fosique.
like where does that come from? Like fake or something?
Yeah, they're fake,
Okay,
folk. They're, or hey, but they're, you could say faux. They're faux,
for
faux.
apesta, sí.
But
Oh my god.
well, with our generational, one of our generational blessings is we can go into anywhere and be a part of that thing, right? If I
Oh
go
yeah.
into Spain, I can be viewed as Spanish. We have a very universal look to us, and also
Yeah.
the ability to be a chameleon anywhere. And that generational blessing I've feel is from, a space of survival. In order for us to survive as a people, we either absorbed into or had things absorb into us, right? Our ancestors. And so to navigate that as almost like a chameleon, to be able to um be in a room of people that that don't know your origins or who you are, and be a part of that space until somebody finds out your last name, like we were talking about
Yeah.
earlier,
Yeah. I'm
you
Taíno,
know
but my last name is Hernandez.
right, or all of those things. Exactly. And so that is, I see as as a generational blessing, right? Where Tainoists at Fobuelas, Fosiques take that generational blessing and weaponize it. So now you have people who have this generational blessing of being a chameleon. Tainos have weaponized that generational blessing to act as race, as a way to race shift into becoming Native American.
Mm.
And
This is
so and so now you've got people who have to believe in these concepts and narratives and idealizations, ideologies. And so now all of a sudden you have these people with this generational gift, a blessing that is now turned into a generational curse that has been weaponized to propel Taínoism within native spaces. And so that's something that you mentioned something. I was like, oh man, this needs to come out. This
Yeah.
needs to be said so that people might be able to see it when they see it.
Yes, I think some pieces of information or narrative need to be addressed right away and strongly,
Mm,
versus others can take a little bit more time because there is also a process to this. When you have adopted something that's inauthentic, to break from it, it's going to break you first, right? It's you know, for me, I had to get my identity stripped, and when I went through it, when I sort of finalized, okay, I'm not this. This isn't real. It felt like a blank canvas, right? To where I was in a position where I would ask myself, so now what? And you realized back then I had an identity. It was false, but at least I had something. And for me, it was rough, but I really believed that I needed to keep going. Now today, obviously, I'm in a much better place, but to have narratives that are told about your people to find out they're not true, this is not what we are, strips a lot from you. But
mm,
my advice would be you got to keep moving, because even if you have nothing, the idea I also had at the time is now I get to paint it authentically, right? So
mm.
so I think it's important for that. That's why I try to have empathy, but sometimes I just look, this is so ridiculous, it's got to stop. Yeah.
You said something that's really important, right? Because when people don't have Taino, what is left? What do we call ourselves if it's not Taino? And that's a question that I get asked a lot. And it seems like whenever I present truth that directly challenges Tainoism, the pushback isn't necessarily from a place of anything other than fear, right?
Yeah.
I have this truth now, where does that put me? Not only am I going to have my identity stripped, my Puerto Rican identity stripped as a diaspora Puerto Rican American, and then become Taino, and then that identity is stripped, what's left?
Yeah.
And, people have asked me a lot, what do I even call myself now? How do I even identify? And I'm like, you're Puerto Rican, man.
Yeah.
You're Puerto
Exactly.
Rican. Like, be proud of that. Be proud of all of the ancestors that made you who you are today. If you want to honor your Boricua ancestors, honor your Boricua ancestors. If you want to honor your African ancestors, honor your African ancestors. You want to honor
Yeah.
your Spanish ancestors, honor your Spanish ancestors, but call them by their rightful name.
Mhm.
Don't erase them with Taino.
Yeah, it goes back to authenticity. There is this concept called syncretism, and it's
Mm,
basically when you mix different things into one thing, right? Now,
mm,
and that's kinda how I see it, to where is that syncretism concept that is kinda how it works for us, to our ancestors mixed culturally, genetically, historically, and now we're here.
mhm. Absolutely. When I was in Spain, it dawned on me that it wasn't just the Spanish that went to the Antilles, it was everyone. It was anybody with a boat that can afford a boat and people to put on that boat and sail there. And so in our island in Puerto Rico, we have three major branches of ancestry, right? Our Indio
Yeah.
Boricua, our African, and our Spanish. And those three major branches make us, like you said, who we are today. They're inextricably inextricably connected. They're interconnected. You cannot disconnect them. They are who we are. And
Mhm.
that's what makes us unique. And, that's what makes us special from another island that may have more African than Spanish, or more French than Spanish, or more more mixed than Spanish, right? Or more Dutch, or more, all of those different countries that influence the culture of the island that they landed in is unique to that island. I wanted to like go back just a little bit earlier to our conversation talking about um the term Taíno being an umbrella term for all of the islands, essentially
Okay.
erasing the diversity of the Greater Antilles. And
Oh,
I
when you
wanted
said suitable replacement, is that what you mean?
Right, as a
Okay.
suitable replacement for the Antillean race, that I wanted to posit um, a, a a question for the listener that really woke me up, and this is something that Dr. Randall Sloan he posited, and it sent me into like I was thought about it for like a week, and I was like, oh my god, like this is so deep and powerful, yet it's so simple, and it really sums it up. And basically, it's the Greater Antilles has a span of 79,000 square miles. Basically, it's the from New York to South Dakota. That's the span of the Greater Antilles. That's how big it is.
Okay.
So
Altogether.
altogether, there are a bunch of different islands that are separated by ocean. So how are we to believe in an area that's the size of New York to South Dakota as one tribe, one belief system, one language, one symbiotic people on different islands, separated by ocean, and then not apply the same diversity that's found in the United States to the Greater Antilles?
And in many other areas in the world, you see the same thing repeated,
Right.
right?
So, I mean, if we were to look at all of Europe, that would be saying before Catholicism, Europe was one tribe that believed in one thing, and they were all the same people, and they all dressed the same, and they all spoke the
Mhm.
same language. And so, how are we to believe in the idea, in the narrative, in the concept that there was one Taíno nation that spanned the Greater Antilles, that all spoke one language, that all dressed the same, that all believed the same thing, that all,
Yeah.
and all of that, all the other things, that all, right? When they're different islands separated by ocean, which leads to the next question. Well, where was Tainolandia, and how come it wasn't on a map? Right? Like, what island was like Taino HQ, right?
Yeah,
Where,
right. Yeah.
wherever, like
Where was the
all the other
capital?
islands, yeah, where all the other islands went, all the other island caciques went over there to figure out, okay, oh, you're speaking that word. Okay, we're gonna use that word too. Oh, this is how you guys are dressing. We're gonna dress that way too. Like, it make sense. Like, the math doesn't math. Like, it is not mathin'.
Yeah.
Like, how is, like, which island was Tainolandia, and
Yeah.
how come it's not on a map? And, so, like,
Mm.
when aligned with logic, right? Tainoism doesn't hold up to critical scrutiny.
Yeah. Yeah, and here's another thing too to follow up on that. As far as I've been able to find through historians, our specific ancestors, the Boricuas, right, the ones that were on the island, they weren't the first ones there either.
Right.
So that only adds to the complexity of the Antilles. So we've talked about how this identity is affecting us today. So I want to go into a subject because this is based on real science, but how it is categorized and used, it's where I see the problem. It's branded as Indigenous Puerto Rico or Taíno, whatever it is. It's something that people used to say, I am Taíno, I am Indigenous. But can you talk to us about how commercial DNA works and how it is presented to the public?
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate you bringing this, topic up with genetics because genetics is different from genealogy.
Right.
Genetics proves biological survival, and then genealogy is
Yeah.
it's familial. Biological survival does not denote uh, a, a existing tribe. Tainoists have managed to manipulate biological survival to equate an existing culture. With regards to commercial DNA tests work within anonymous reference panels. So we send in a spit test, and that spit test is then compared to an anonymous reference panel, not mom and dad. It's an anonymous reference panel of people made up across the Greater Antilles. So it may not even be specific to Puerto Rico. It could be
Mm.
Cuba or whatever. And so, um, that those markers, those DNA markers, are then compared to that reference panel and then filtered through an algorithm that determines the percentage of DNA markers that align with that anonymous reference panel. And so that's how those percentages are created.
Are the genetic tests done by, let's just say, Cruzado or other places like PubMed or PLOS, these more institutional science-based organizations, are they more trustworthy, and should we go about what they claim rather than commercial DNA?
Well, commercial DNA is for entertainment purposes only.
Yeah.
It's not to be taken as a determinant of identity, even though Tainoists use commercial DNA tests as a determinant of Taino-ness. With Martin Cruzado, with Martinez Cruzado in 2001, they analyzed 56 people, and he split them into two groups based on phenotype. These people look Indio, these people don't look Indio. And then and from that, so you've got 56 people basically out of 3.8 million Puerto Ricans at the time. Obviously, that's a misrepresentation. And in
Right.
those 56 individuals, it was determined that 60 to 80% of the people who looked Indio, they had indigenous DNA. Tainoists have manipulated that study to say everyone on the island 50 to 60 to 80% of the people in the island have indigenous DNA. So it's a manipulation of genetic science. So the science itself is valid. However, the manipulation of the
Mm,
science is what makes it distorts how that science was originally um,
mm,
determined.
okay. See, the way I see this, and you tell me what you think about my framework. We come from the same pool of ancestry, right? When we look at our history, we see the mixing from the beginning. We can look through history, see some of the migrations. Not everybody who came stayed. Some people left. So it's more complex than just seeing 100,000 people came from Spain to Puerto Rico, so we are this percentage Spanish or French or whatever. Well, not everyone stayed.
Mm.
So it's like I said, it's more complex. But the mixing happened, and many people stayed on the island and continued on. To me, the way I see it is where we Puerto Ricans have been reconfiguring our same ancestry again and again to the point where we all come from a pool of ancestry. And I see it that way. Okay, this is our population. Our population contains indigenous DNA. Is that accurate?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Our biological survival with regards to um our indigenous bloodlines is present in DNA tests. That's not debatable.
Right.
That is absolutely a very real thing.
Yeah. I'm
But
glad.
but does that also give the right of people to say, okay, I'm going to rename that indigenous bloodline as Taíno and then create a whole culture around it that
Yeah.
never existed for our original indigenous ancestors in the first place?
Right. Yeah. It has no continuity at all because it started in the 1960s or 70s as a big thing.
The Taino identity essentially started in, 90s, 80s, 90s, 70s, 80s, 90s.
All right. Because to me, this is important because just looking at genetic studies done on our population, what is found is the same thing again and again and again. That three-way of ancestry: European, African, Indigenous, Boricua, Iberian, and different African tribes. And we see that every genetic study that I've found that's non-commercial, it's found the same thing: that three-way makeup. So let me ask you this: for those people who use the commercial DNA as a way of identity, even if they don't use it for Taino, what how would you tell them to look at it?
Well, yeah, I mean, like, Ancestry is an American-run company. I mean, they're owned by the Mormons, I mean, the more that our culture is kept in confusion about our original identities, the easier it is to marginalize our population.
Okay. So I guess the best way is just see it a as a confirmation that we do come from this specific mix that happened throughout history, rather than use it to specifically amount what you are is based on the percentages or anything.
Correct. There's a recent um, there's something that the Odanak tribe in Vermont has commissioned called the Genealogy Research Project, where they went in and did the genealogy of dozens of people who claim Abenaki heritage. It's falsely claim Abenaki heritage. And what they did with their genetics was they did their genealogy to find out who in their bloodline, who in their family lineage is native. And what they found was none of them were native. And so what they did, which was something that I found brilliant, they used the percentages that they brought in for the people were by region. So if 30% of their genealogy comes from England, then that would be that 30% English rather than a spit test to a reference panel filtered through an algorithm. So to
Mm,
me, that's a much more effective way of learning a person's true percentages in their lineage rather than this process that is more of a comparison and then anonymous comparison, and then filtered through an algorithm where it personalizes a person's actual heritage. So
Yeah.
when I saw that, I was, oh man, this is that's how
Yeah.
it should be done.
Yeah, yeah, because it's specifically to the people that actually brought you here
Correct.
instead of population genetics. Although population genetics, it's a real thing. One thing I've learned, and you tell me what you think about this. And mixed populations do become over time. If you give them isolation and time, they become their own unique genetic makeup. But to know what that specific genetic makeup, you need the genealogy. What do you think about that?
Absolutely. Genealogy is very much how we can determine our heritage. I mean, I've done my family tree, for example, which is essentially, it's genealogy. And so I determined that my family bloodlines go all the way to Puerto Rico to 1504.
Okay,
And that
awesome.
was the first person that was born in the island in my family line was 1504.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, and so then before that it was Spain or, France or whatever, and like, different places, but I can take that percentage and say, okay, well, 80% of my genealogy is Puerto Rican.
Mm,
And that connects me to the island of Puerto Rico. That is when I did my genealogy, it was an actual real connection. It was something that I can see. I could see my ancestors' names. I could see where they were born, where they were buried. All of the things, right? Which is a great connection. Um, and it helped me in my sense of reconnecting to that displacement of being growing up in the diaspora, but also being, you know, connected to the island. And so it added a layer of an unbreakable connection because that's my family, that's my bloodline. That is undeniable. That is undeniable proof and evidence that my ancestors have been in the island for centuries. But with DNA, it's just a percentage to brand Taíno, to that high control group Taíno, which can be manipulated in a number of ways and is always evolving and changing and doesn't have any grounding in anything other than what is determined by that cabal, right?
yeah,
By the
yeah,
fobuelas and the fosiques.
yeah,
But
yeah.
that
It's
cannot
something that
go ahead.
it's real. It's what you are.
Exactly, exactly. And so I can look to that and feel connected and experience that belonging because I see it right there. You can't
Yeah,
deny that, right? But like if it's a random percentage that an American company gave me so that I can begin to claim this fabricated identity that doesn't play into connection, it serves to affect and deepen the disconnection using science as a vessel to anchor that disconnection so that people can be told whatever about their ancestry and then believe it as long as it's through that lens or through the filter of Tainoism.
yeah. Okay. So I think,
I know that's heavy, huh?
yeah, yeah, because imagine this, right? We do have the world of genetics that is now real, right? Because I have this belief, right? Because people come up with all kinds of stories of what they are, who they are. When you challenge them, always at some point when they have no way to exit, they revert back to ancestry. Oh, mom and dad. Okay, then that's what we are. That's what never fails, right? When everything fails, back to ancestry, back to mom and dad. So, and to me, that's what it is because You are your mom and dad. Ancestrally speaking, you are part of this group that brought you into this world, and that's something that not only you were born with, you die with that. Nobody can take that from you.
Mm. Truth, right? Because it shows up in people's health. You know?
That's another thing. That's another thing that people kind of shy away from genetics being used as ancestry, but the moment it goes into health benefits or care for this because you might be more prone to this illness, then they care about it. Then genetics become something that matters. It's genetics is just information.
Mm.
That's it. That's how I see it. How that information is used, it's a different story. But
And distorted.
yeah, and exactly. Perfect. So I guess when it comes to genetics, we all have to understand it's a real thing, but we need to be careful about how we read it so that it doesn't get distorted and we read it for what it is. Information about us. That's really all it is at the end of the day. But I'm not a geneticist. I would recommend the book Who We Are and How We Got Here by David Reich for anybody who's interested. But yeah, I'm no geneticist. It's just what I've learned.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, people hear the term genealogy and it's like this, uh,
Taboo.
well, I mean, it's so daunting, right? Like, how am I going to find all these people and stuff like that? And,
Oh,
and it's a daunting thing. But, I also have started to respond with, if you can go through your partner's phone and find out
uh-oh.
all these things, or if your friend goes, hey, can you give me information on so and so, and then in 5 minutes you have like where they grew up and who, all of the
Yeah.
things. if you
This has
if
turned
you
into a different conversation here.
right, but if you can do all of those things, you can do your family tree.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess if you can just search online, you can find it.
You can do your family tree. And ancestry actually, as much as they as much as genetics and the percentages have been distorted, from ancestry, their family tree part of ancestry is really easy to use. And
Okay.
yeah, and it's user friendly. It takes some time, to make sure that those lineages are accurate. And they're always updating constantly the lineages. And so anybody who, if they want to build a connection outside of Taínoism through their family line, I, absolutely encourage and support and promote doing uh, uh, your family tree. It's just necessary so that we can build that connection and heal that trauma of
Yeah.
displacement.
Yeah, absolutely. And going back to what we said earlier, from the beginning, our indigenous ancestors and the Spanish, they had a different vibe on the island to where they kind of creating their own thing. So historically, we've been from the beginning trying to be our own people. Genetically, and I would say culturally and historically, we are a unique people,
Mhm.
right? And when you have that, you have something authentic that you can claim whole. So you can
Mm.
see that.
Yeah, absolutely. When I was doing my family tree, I realized that in Puerto Rico, our genealogy isn't a tree, right? It's more like a wreath going going
Yeah,
to,
yeah.
going to some, a few conquistadors in the initial creation of our Puerto Rican culture. And through that, because the Indio Boricua people didn't have documentation, right? So how are we supposed
Mm,
to know our Indio Boricua genealogy when there was no documentation until after the Spanish got there? But we can surmise that if the person in our genealogy wasn't born in Spain, but died in Puerto Rico, that person was probably an Indio or somebody that was
Oh, I
indigenous
see.
to the island.
To where when it comes to the classification of as a census, so to speak, if we don't see them being born in Spain but died in Puerto Rico, where did it come from? Because of
Right.
the island.
Exactly.
Okay, I think.
I want to ask you a question.
Okay, go ahead.
Growing up in the island, hearing Taíno, and then learning that Taíno is a fabricated concept, how did you navigate that?
Okay, I think this is where the experience of the diaspora and island really becomes different, or at least one aspect, because when we learn about Taino, it was framed as they're extinct. But my community also taught us, all of us, would also reinforce to one another that we are a mix of the Tainos, the Spanish, and the Africans. So we always knew that somehow we were mixed. It never really crossed my mind they were extinct. They got absorbed, right? At
Mm,
the time, I didn't fully understand that's what I was thinking, but now that's what I understand, right? That's what mestizaje does. It
mhm,
creates a new population. So when I learn about Taino just being this invented identity, it never erased the fact that I'm still part indigenous. Never
mhm,
took that out. It was more of a the authenticity of what we are and who we are. And what that taught me was that our population really became something that just started absorbing anything from outside, especially the United States. If it came from the United States, it was meant to, this is better. So this is supposed to be taken and replaced. So when I learned about Taino being not real, I would say that it didn't destroy me because I already had the Puerto Rican identity, which was we are a mix. And what is that mix that has been told to us from the beginning, from children? We're Puerto Ricans. And Puerto
mhm,
Ricans are a mix of X, Y, and Z, right? But earlier when I talked about my identity being destroyed, there were other aspects like, oh, we're Americans. We're not. We're Taino. We're not. And there were other beliefs that I was destroying because they weren't true. But I would say I think that is the difference between the island and the diaspora when it comes to that. And that is the fact that on the island, we're growing up with one another. In here, you're growing up with everybody else.
mm,
So you absorb things from other people that are not authentic. And then when the island and diaspora meet each other, it happened to me where it feels different. Feels like, yeah, you're my people. On the same token, I can connect.
mm,
I think it's just that where we're the same people, but we can't connect the same anymore because in the diaspora, it's becoming more and more Americanized. And I can see that
mm,
over generations, the Puerto Rican population could dissolve away in the diaspora.
wow. That's sad.
Yeah, yeah. The thing is, we can leave that to chance. If we want to continue on, we have to be intentional about continuing. And for that, we need one another.
Mm,
And that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to build something to where no future generation ever has to be confused again. So that confusion finds no refuge in our minds, right?
mhm.
And that's what I'm trying to build here.
That's powerful, man. Thank you. I was wondering, one of the things that I call it a coming home journey,
Right.
where being a diaspora Puerto Rican, my journey is to connect back to the island. And I I feel that that's a lot of what Taínoism is to connect people to island culture, but Taínoism teaches people to connect to Taínoism, not being Puerto Rican.
Yeah.
And hearing somebody that grew up in Puerto Rico that has been, in that culture, and then also living in the States and being able to identify the differences in how you do is important for people that may only have the diaspora experience or only have the island experience, to be able to put that empathy or compassion in people who are seeking their identity and are only offered, one facet, whether that be Tainoism or American.
Yeah, yeah.
Because in the diaspora, we're told, you're Puerto Rican, but it's so exotic as a diaspora. Like, ooh, I'm Puerto Rican, but what does that even mean? What does it mean to be Puerto Rican? What does it mean to have that heritage? And as Puerto Ricans in the diaspora, to break free of Tainoism, to explore that. What does it mean to be Puerto Rican? I agree. It's one of the things that can connect us both in the island and in the diaspora together under that real, authentic identity,
Yeah.
Puerto Rican.
And to me, being Puerto Rican, I could summarize it in one word. And I choose this word because when you look at not just our history, but human history, a lot of things change. Cultures, human events, crisis, natural disasters, your culture evolves into something different. But no matter what changes, when there's continuity in a people, it doesn't matter what changes. Nothing replaces you. So to me,
Mm.
what we are is a family, right?
Hmm.
And when I look at everything that I can possibly get my hands on that can shape identity, continuity becomes a really big thing for me. Because can let's say a green-eyed blondie, pale as paper, goes to Hawaii and learns the language, writes like them, speaks like them, adopts everything. Does she become Hawaiian?
No.
Right. Exactly. Right. So when people talk about being Puerto Rican is just a nationality, they completely miss the mark
Mm.
because nationalities don't create people. People create nationalities. Your nationality is how the world knows who you are. But we are a people with a nationality, just like we are a people with a culture, with a history. And we are unique, just like every population on Earth. If you give them enough time, they become unique. Like, so, yeah, no, we're not a nationality. We are a people with a nationality. And when that continuity in the people keeps on happening, it doesn't matter what happens. You're still you. And so are your children and your children's children. And it just continues on.
Absolutely. I do want to share something about continuity that
Yeah.
Tainoists distort. And so Tainoists use and I love what you said, and I really appreciate it because I agree with you, I mean, it's the continuity of our Puerto Rican heritage goes the island to Spain and to Africa. And you know, that is something that is historically accurate. And Tainoists have distorted that continuity to only specifically focus on the indigeneity essentially of the island. But when people look at historical continuity, that historical continuity has criteria. And one of the main criteria of historical continuity is governance.
Okay.
And so, historical continuity for indigenous tribes in North America, Canada, South America is that that tribe has governance. And that tribe's government has been historically continuous since first contact and beyond. In Puerto Rico, we do not have a historically continuous government that would classify the indigenous biomarkers as a historically continuous indigenous community. And so that distortion of continuity without having that historical continuity within the realm of the governance of a community is one of that, confusion parts that you're talking, that wonderful quote that you shared earlier about, and not allowing confusion to take hold in the mind is one of the ways that Tainoists have distorted historical continuity. Even though in Puerto Rico, the the government of the Indio Boricua people were, castigados, and then we had the Puerto Rican government in the island. And so that government is continuous. It's historically continuous and may have been influenced by the castigados that were in the island. We don't
Okay.
know, but that historical one government can be traced and documented and is well known. That's historical continuity. So I think
Mm.
if when people look at historical continuity and in an indigenous community is a criteria for being considered a legitimate indigenous community, it's how, where is that government? How long have you had
Right.
a tribal government that has historical continuity from the time where contact happened to that tribe? And in Puerto Rico, we don't have that. So, how are we going to say that we have a historically continuous tribal entity when A, Taíno is a fabrication, and B, we've been continually, absorbed and remade and connected, yet we've
Exactly.
always been Puerto Rican.
Yeah. Where's your president? Where's he been?
Right, or we've always been Puerto Rican or Borinqueños or,
Yeah.
whatever, but, like, that island, that is historical continuity. We have that in our island already,
Yeah.
and yeah, so
Yeah. And the thing is that the indigenous people in the Americas that have that governance have that continuity despite the colonization in the Americas. So it survived even through that.
mhm,
With us, it didn't. Small island, it got replaced by the crown became the government.
mhm,
It's really what happened. So to us, the colonization come from the United States. It
mhm.
doesn't come from our ancestors because we are our ancestors. I don't think you can colonize yourself, right?
Well, Taínos colonize themselves,
Well, well, I guess you can. So
and then are proud to call themselves Taíno, which is colonizing themselves.
yeah, yeah. So I guess yeah, yeah.
I
You're
don't
right.
mean to laugh, but,
No, it's okay.
at the end of the day, that's the reality.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of like when we call ourselves Americans. Oh, we are
Mm.
Americans. Are we? You know, our
Right?
language is different, our traditions are different, and the way we act with one another is different. But well, Tanya, thank you. I really appreciate. I'm really grateful for you sharing all of this, not just hiding, stepping back, but you actually chose to write papers, come out on a podcast, so the information can get out there. Especially from somebody who's been in one of these groups or many groups.
It's an honor.
Yeah. So I want to ask you one question. So I want to ask you this. Like, imagine that is 500 years from now. You can imagine any world, post apocalyptic, we're living in space, whatever you want. But you and I, everyone alive today, it's long gone. But a young Puerto Rican girl stumbles across this video somehow and is searching for who they are. You know, maybe they've never heard your name, my name. Maybe we're just some sort of whisper in a bloodline. And you have one moment to speak across time. What is the one message you live for them?
Oh my gosh, I love this question.
Yeah, and all you can do is all they're gonna see is this message. This is the one message.
Oh, wow. Um, that's so heavy. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it's
Uh,
only one message, and they'll never see you again.
only one message?
Yep.
Wow, I've got like 20 million things running
Yeah.
through my head, you know? Like, um, so that one message, I keep on hearing, um, never forget who you are. You are your ancestors' prayers realized,
Mm.
and stand up for them every chance you get, and don't let them ever be erased by anything. You'll
Beautiful.
always be Boricua. You'll always be Puerto Rican. You'll always be who you are and who you are of. And don't ever forget that.
I love it. I really do. Well, thank you. Thank you, Tanya. I hope that any girl ever that hears this gets every courage it needs to stand up for it.
Yeah, it's important. That's one of the things, that's why I do this work, is because for the past inception of Taíno in 1967, there's been quite a few people that have stood up for our ancestors and said, "Basta con este Taíno cosa. What is this? You know, that's not who we come from." You know,
Yeah.
like, "¿Qué esto?" You know,
Yeah, que esto,
um,
mira este.
and so betrayal is a big part of our colonial wound,
Yeah.
and I want to stand up for my ancestors. And one of the things I can't understand is how come more people aren't absolutely infuriated that Taino has come in to erase their legacy and memory and identity. And so that's the core, who's going to stand up for them? I will.
Yeah. Yeah. We will. Well,
We we will. Definitely.
anything else you want to leave with?
Thank you very much for this opportunity to share this information with you and all of you who are listening. And if you want to connect with me, I'm totally open to having more discussion about this and being there, holding space for people who are healing from Tainoism, disaffiliating from Tainoism. I've been there, I know what it's like, and I'm here for it, and I'm here for you. So thank you.
Okay. Absolutely. You're welcome. And I will link her website and social media down in the description so that you can easily find her.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you, Tanya.
Thank you very much, Pairo.
All right.